Pagination is a common data loading pattern because of its UX and performance benefits. So instead of trying to load this huge list of all of our data, we can load just a little bit of that and give our user a way to navigate through the rest. So once we start to navigate through, we also get things like URL pagination, where we can navigate directly to that page of results rather than again having to scroll through all those lists. And we also avoid making that huge request of all that data. So it's going to help our performance and load things quicker. Now, finally, in order to speed up the UX a little bit further, we can take advantage of React features like Suspense. So if we have a slow query running for that pagination, we don't have to prevent the rest of the page from loading. Now, if you want to start off with the basics of building a full stack Next.js app, including getting that data in there in the first place, locked down with authentication, make sure you sign up for exclusive access to my upcoming course at spacejelly.dev/nextjs. All right, so we're going to start off inside of the app where we have all of our data being loaded by one initial query. Inside of the code, I'm using Drizzle ORM in order to query my Zata database, where once I have all my results and formatted my actual data, I'm simply dumping them out into a table and then formatting the data points as I need them. Now, my internet's pretty fast, and I'm only loading some demo data here where I have about 21 rows that I'm being loaded. But imagine a situation where you have thousands and thousands of rows. You realistically don't want to be showing thousands and thousands of entries inside of that one long list. And on top of that, trying to get all that data in one query is really going to start to slow things down. So there's a couple things that we want to do here. First, we want to see how we can only grab the first set of rows in that initial query. Next, we want to see how we can grab the next set of rows for our subsequent query, where then once we have that mechanism in place where we can start to grab page by page, we want to see how we can start to set up the actual pagination UI, where if we start clicking ahead, we can actually query for that page. So to start off, the first thing I want to do is limit the amount of rows that I want to get in that initial query. So I'm going to use the .limit method, where let's start off with just 5 because that's a good way to visualize how many we're actually getting. Now we can see the page already reloaded, where now I only have those 5 items that are being displayed on that initial request. But how do I get to the rest of the items? Now, in order to actually shift ahead to the second set of results, we can use what's called the offset method. So if I now use offset, and let's just start with maybe number 2, just to kind of see how this works, we can see that this is actually only moved ahead 2. So we can see some of the same data within these rows, where if I remove that 2 again, we can still see that number 3 is Philip Fry when I query for all the data. But again, when I shift ahead with an offset, so let's go back to 2, we can see that now Philip is going to be the first item because I'm shifting ahead with that offset value. So what I realistically want to do is I want to shift ahead the same number that I'm limiting. So I'm going to have a certain amount of items that I show on the page. And every single time I ask for a new page, I want to shift ahead that many items multiplied by the page that I'm actually on. So let's start off by going to the second page, where that would be an offset of 5. So we can see that we no longer see Fry here, but we have the second page of results. Now, if we wanted to go to the third page of results, you probably guessed it, we're going to multiply 5 by 2. So if we do, just for illustrative purposes, 5 by 2, we can see that we jumped ahead another set of results. Now, the way that I usually like to set this up is I like to store this value in a variable just so that I can really keep things in sync. So let's say, for instance, I say constant invoices per page, and let's set that to 5. And then I can replace the limit of 5. I can replace the offset of 5 times 2. So again, 2 is going to give me that third page. And that still works as expected. But now I want to set it up so that page number is going to be dynamic. Now, in the complete example that I showed you earlier, I was able to navigate to different pages where what's actually happening inside that pagination UI is I'm going to a different page inside of the URL. So it's going to be the URL-based state, which is going to just make things a little bit easier, and that's going to be able to come from the server and manage all that. So it's just going to be a better way to handle that experience. So I'm going to try to replicate that, where ultimately what I want to do is I want to be able to read this page number, and then I'm going to take that in, which is going to help me define that offset. So back to the original app, let's start off by adding page equals 2 so that we can start to read that inside of the app, where this is going to come in as a parameter to the dashboard component. So I'm going to say we're going to grab our search params. And of course, I need to type that out. So I'm going to have my search params. And inside of that, I'm going to have my page number, which can either be a string because it's coming through the URL, or it can be undefined. But now if I head back over and let's just console log this out to see what this looks like. I'm going to console log out search params.page. We can see that once we refresh the page, we can see inside of the terminal our search params value, which is going to be that number 2, which we can see correlates to the page that's inside of that URL. So going to the code, let's actually define that offset, where I'm going to say constant offset is equal to my invoices per page multiplied by my search params page, where we can see that we're getting some squiggly lines. And the issue is this is coming in as a string because it's coming in from the URL. So the first thing we want to do is we want to normalize this as an actual number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say constant current page is equal to, and we want to make sure that search params.page exists. And if it does, we're going to say we want to parse the int of the search params.page so that we get a number value for that page. Now further, in case search params.page doesn't exist, we still want to have a current page. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to change this to a ternary, where we're going to say in case that doesn't exist, we're just going to default to 1. So now that we know that our current page is going to be a number, we can now replace the search params.page, and our offset should now be a number, which I can now replace inside of that offset field. Now, if I go back to the first page, we can see that I'm actually not getting the right results. If we remember, I was on the home page and also Fry was on that home page. So it seems like we're going ahead one. Now, if we remember from before, the way that this offset works is we're shifting ahead that number. So if we're on the first page or number 1, we don't want to shift ahead 5. We want to just leave that as that first 0 and not shift ahead at all. So what we can do is we can say that we want to do invoices per page multiplied by current page minus 1, so that if we're on the first page, it's going to be by 0. If we're on the second page, it's going to shift ahead 5 so that we can get the right page. Now, alternatively, you can start at a 0 index for that current page if you want to, but I kind of like the idea of my first page being the first page. So it really just kind of depends on how you want to set it up inside of your application. But going back to the application, we can see me at the top again, and we have all of our favorite characters. Now, if I start to go to page number 2, we can see that we get the next set of results and so on. If we go to number 3, and if we go to number 1, we can see that we still go to that first page. Okay, so now we actually have the navigation mechanism in place. So when we're actually clicking the buttons in the Pagination UI, we have a way to actually getting to the different results. So now let's actually add that UI. Now I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here where I'm just adding some really basic UI that we're going to use in order to do this pagination. So if I hide myself here, we can see that I have a previous at the bottom, I have the number 1, which we'll get to, and I also have the next. So number 1 and all those different numbers are going to allow me to go to a specific page, but the previous and next are going to allow me to actually jump one by one forward and backwards through those results. Now, just to kind of see what this looks like in practice, I have an unordered list here where I have all of my different links. So we're starting off with this previous link, which we can see that it's just a little icon and the word previous. We can go down and we can see that I'm starting off with just a simple button that includes the number 1, and we'll see how we can dynamically start to set this up. And then if we go ahead even further, we have our third list item in this particular list, which is going to be the next one, again, with our actual icon. Now, I'm not doing anything necessarily special here. It's just some unordered lists with some links and buttons. But if you want to follow along and actually check out this code as it's completed, you can see the code example inside of the description. But starting off for the first thing, let's actually make these next and previous buttons work. If we remember for what we just set up, we have our current page and we have our offset. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to use the mechanism where we set a different page based off of the current page. So starting with the previous link, if we go to our href here, we can set this up as a dynamic value where we can say /dashboard, where we can add our page equals query parameter, where we're going to say current page minus 1. So now if we're on page 2, for instance, and I hit previous, we can see that we immediately went to page 1 because we navigated to that first page from page 2. Now this is probably fine, but there's a little bit better of a syntax that we can use in order to just simply change the query param. So instead of defining this as a string, I'm going to define this as an object where I'm going to set the query where it's going to be page equals that current page minus 1. And this is probably personal preference that I would prefer to have it structured like this rather than a string. But this might be a little bit better way to take advantage of some of the Next.js features inside of that link component. But now we can see that our previous link, and if I inspect it here, we can see that it's showing that question mark page equals 1, where if I click that, it's going to go to the previous page. Now, as you can see that this has question mark page equals 0, and because it's a relative path, it's going to shift me back using that /page as the path name. But if I did want to manually define that, I can specify the path name equals /dashboard, which would actually update that link in the DOM where we have /dashboard page equals 0 since I'm on page 1. But that leads us to another issue where if we do try to now go to that page 0, we can see that we get an error because as it says, it must not be negative. So what we're going to do is we're going to detect what page we're on, and depending on what page we're on, if we are on page 1, we're just going to show a static non-clickable link, but if we're on a page greater than 1, then we'll show the link as it is inside of the UI right now. So I'm going to say if current page is greater than 1, then I'm going to go ahead and show that previous link. And if current page is less than or equal to 1, then I'm going to do something similar, but I'm just going to show that span. So if I go back to page 1, we can see that now that previous link isn't actually a link anymore. It's just going to be some text. But if I go to page 2, we can see that that is now a link. And if I click it, I go back to page 1, and again, no longer a link. Now, when doing this, it probably makes sense to make sure that the UI is indicating that it's no longer a link. So we can probably do one of two things where we can probably just simply remove it if that's what we want to do. Otherwise, we can change the color to a really light gray to make sure that it displays relative to the other ones that it's an inactive link. So what we can do is something like text zinc 400. But if we go back to the page, we can see that it's a really light gray link and it looks inactive relative to the other links. Now, from a UX perspective, some people would probably recommend that you just don't show it at all because a link on there still looks like it might be clickable. But regardless, that's probably going to be your choice for how you want to proceed with that UX. But now let's do that exact same thing, but let's do it for the next link. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm just going to copy this same logic. I'm going to go down to the next button. I'm going to paste that inside where we're going to update this logic in a second. But the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I get the next button or text and the icon. So let's replace the chevron left with our next. And then we want to update this current page logic so that we check and see if it's at the end of the list. Now, the tricky thing here is we don't know the total number of items that are inside this list. So we don't really have anything good to go off of until we start to query for that total value. Now, there's kind of two approaches that people take here. Some people might try to allow you to click through and try to query for that data and see if it exists, but that's not really a great user experience because somebody's trying to click for something that doesn't exist only to get an error or some kind of message or just the UI just not do anything because that doesn't actually exist. So what we probably want to do is we want to get that total number of items inside of the list so that we can actually display how many, or we can always display the next link reliably inside of the UI. So we're going to put this logic on hold for a second, and we're going to first query for the total number of items inside of the table or the rows inside of the table. So I'm going to go up to the top here. I'm going to first duplicate this existing query for my results. I'm going to get rid of offset and limit because that's going to kind of go against the idea that we're getting the total count. I'm going to change this to invoices count. And instead of just trying to select everything, I'm going to pass in an object and I'm going to try to get the count, where I'm going to then use the count function where I can now import that from Drizzle ORM specifically. We can see that that automatically added to the Drizzle ORM import. Where now, before we do anything else, let's go ahead and console log this out just to make sure that this is working. So if I now refresh the page, where now we can see that in addition to this params that I never removed, we are getting that invoices count. So we now have that total number, which in this case, I have 21 rows, which is exactly right. Now we could probably even shorthand this a little bit if you want, where I can define my array and the object, which is going to be the first thing. I'm going to get my count and we can rename that to invoices count, which is going to give me that number instead of that array of objects. But now that we have this invoices count, let's use it to update our next link. So I'm going to go back down to that next link and we want to update this logic so that it reflects that we don't want to go to a page more than the pages that we have in total so that we don't get another error and just so that everything's working as expected. So this time we want to make sure that this is going to be the current page is less than the value, where we're going to say that our invoices count, and we're going to divide that by the total number of invoices that we have per page, which if we remember, we made this invoices per page as a variable. So I'm going to say that I want my invoices count divided by invoices per page, which is going to give me the total number of pages that I have. Now, because this could give me a decimal, I want to do one more thing, and I'm going to wrap that in math.ceil or ceiling so that it's going to go to the number above whatever that decimal is, because ultimately that last page could have a few results. So that's why we want to go to the ceiling instead of something like the floor. Now, of course, we want to do the opposite for if we want to show just that static link. So I'm going to copy that logic and I'm going to replace the else or, the other logic that we have. And I'm going to change that to greater than equal than, and we can refactor this in a second, but let's just check if this works and make sure that I update this to next instead of, I don't know why that didn't take earlier. Maybe I accidentally undid it. But now going back to the UI, let's go ahead and try to click this next link. And it looks like I actually forgot to implement the href of this, where of course we don't want to go to a previous page. We want to go to the next page. So we're going to do +1 instead of -1. And of course, this time, if I hit next, we can see that we go to page 2. If I hit next again, we can go to page 3. And if we start going through all the different pages, we shouldn't have too many. We can see that we do get that final page with one result, and we have the grayed out next button because we don't have any other pages to navigate to. Now, like I said, we can probably refactor this logic because it's kind of ugly having that as the conditionals there, but we're going to eventually move this into a component. So let's just sit tight and wait until we actually do that. But before we do that, the final thing I want to do is I want to now loop through and I want to create a new number button for every single item that's in that list so that if I click 1, 2, 3, 4, I can actually go to that exact page. So let's start this off where the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the invoices or type of invoices count equals number to make sure that that number is actually available. That way we can only show the UI and the logic inside if that is the case. And inside of my unordered list, I ultimately want to create an array that I'm going to use to loop through all the different values. Now I can create a new array on the fly by the number that I choose, which is going to be that total number of pages. So the way that I'm going to set this up is I'm going to create a new empty array, but inside I'm going to spread out the value of a new array where I'm going to pass in the number of pages that I want to create. And in this instance, I'm going to do a similar thing to what I did here in order to get the number of pages. So I'm going to use that same value. I'm going to pass that in as my array value so that it's now going to create an array with that many items inside. But with that, I can now map through it where inside I'm just going to set up my arguments where the first one I'm not going to use because it's just going to be an undefined or a null value or something like that. But what I want to do is I want to use the index, which is going to tell me the number of the page or spot in the array that that value is going to be in. But now I ultimately want to return that new UI element, which is going to be my list item. So let's copy and paste that inside. Where the way that we can get the page number that we want to navigate to is I can say my constant page is going to be equal to index +1. And again, this might depend on if you're starting your pages at 0 or 1, because arrays do start at 0, but we're using a page number 1 so that it makes a little bit more sense in the UI from a UX perspective. From maybe someone that's not technical, they don't know to start from 0, they know to start from 1 for page 1. So in this case, because I'm starting from 1, we want to make sure we get to that page 1 by adding a 1 to whatever that index is going to be. But now, similar to before, we can now update our href, where inside we're going to have our query, which will have our page. Well, I can pass that right through as page. And then we want to make sure we have our path name, which will be dashboard in our case, if I spell that right. Now, we also want to make sure that we're showing the right page number. So instead of this 1, let's update that to the value. And as soon as the page refreshes, we can now see that we do have that numbered list of all the different pages that we can navigate to. So let's try, we're on page 5, let's try to navigate to 3. We can see that we were immediately navigated to 3. We did lose that though. And it looks like it might be because I never added a key prop. So on our list item, let's add a key, which we can just make it page. And funny enough, you usually don't see the keys actually making an impact, but this time we can see that it clearly did. But I went back to page 5 just so we can prove this works. And I go to 3, we can see that it works. I can go to 2, I can go to 1, and we can see that it is switching to the different pages based off of those numbers that we're clicking. Now, depending on the components you use, we can use different options to style this differently based off of the page that we're on. So for this, for instance, I'm using shadcn where the button has a variant on it that I can use to style it a little bit differently based off that page. So I'm going to say variant is equal to, where I'm going to say if page equals current page. That way I can see, are we on the current page? Do it one way versus the other. And let's do, if we are on the current page, I can show it as default. Otherwise, I want to show it as outline. So now we can see that the page that we're on looks like it's highlighted, where the others just looks like they're empty buttons that I can use to select the page that I want to actually visit. So I think we're at a pretty good place with our pagination where we have our URL structure set up. We have our next, our previous, we have all the different numbers. We're not going to get too much deeper into the number aspect of this, but I'll just say that from a UI perspective, there's a couple different ways that you can handle this, where I know some people show more numbers on hover. Some people do where you maybe only show the adjacent numbers to the active page and the ends because it can get like a really long list, but I'm not going to go too much deeper into this. But what we're going to cover next is that query that we're making in order to get those total pages. What if that query is hanging and it's going to slow down the rest of the page? Now, the way that we currently have this set up is everything in the UI is being blocked by all of these requests being fulfilled. So again, while my internet is pretty fast, if I reload the page, everything loads pretty quickly. But if this particular query to get the total number of invoices inside of my database takes a really long time, that's going to slow down the whole page, rather than if I have some kind of mechanism where I can show all the results from the table as soon as that's ready, and then maybe load in the other one later. But that's where something like Suspense comes in, where we can make sure that we're only prioritizing that main query for the table. And then as soon as it's ready, after it comes in, we can show the additional pagination. Now, one thing to make a note on is in order to have access to Suspense, you got to make sure that you're using a framework that takes advantage of that. So that might include something like Next.js, which allows you to use Suspense within that framework, but it might only work if the data fetching method is actually enabled for that particular component or that framework. Now, the tricky thing is with using Suspense, though, is those data fetching requests need to be within the bounds of that Suspense component. And right now, we have all that data being fetched at the top level parent component or our page, that server component, and then being fed into the different components and the elements. So we need to abstract this a little bit so that we can move that data fetching logic in a way that will allow us to use Suspense. So this is where that component comes into play, where I'm going to be able to use that component to contain the data fetching logic for that query. So if I head down to my components and I create a new pagination.tsx, let's make an async function called pagination, which is going to be our component. I can export my default of pagination. Inside, we're going to ultimately want to return that same exact UI that we've been creating. So I'm going to head over to my page. Let me get rid of the sidebar. I'm going to find my pagination down here. Or is it the unordered list? And I'm going to cut all that out and I'm going to paste that right inside of my pagination component. Now we got to make sure that we're able to still pass in all those same data points into this component so that it's able to create that dynamic logic. So going down the list, it's mostly focused on our current page. We have our invoices count. We have our invoices per page. And I think aside from the components, that should really get us the full way there. So what I'm going to do is let's first start to import those components. I got my link, my icon, we got my button, and we got the last icon. But now let's set up the dynamic variables, or the props rather, so that we can pass this information in. So I'm going to set up a new interface of pagination props, where we have our current page, which is going to be a number. Rather, we have our invoices count, where at this point we can just call it count, and we can pass that in as a number. And then we also have our invoices per page, and we can say per page instead of invoices per page, which is also going to be a number. Now I just remembered we're going to actually make that query count inside of the component, at least for now, so we can actually get rid of the per page and the count because we're going to still calculate those inside. But then I can go ahead and destructure my current page. I can set up my props. So now we have the current page going through. Let's set up the rest. Where I just noticed it looks like this link was imported wrong. So let's go ahead and fix this for a second. Import link from next link. I can also import my at components/UI button. But now at the top of my actual page, I'm going to grab that query for the invoices count. And let's get rid of that console log as well. So I'm going to paste this in at the top of my pagination prop, where we can see that we get a lot of squiggly lines. Let's start importing all this stuff in. We have our database, we have our invoices, customers. We're going to get our count from Drizzle ORM, EQ, and is null. And then ultimately our user ID, which we can actually get similarly to how we were doing it before. So let's go ahead and copy that user ID inside, where I can now import that from clerk. And now the only other thing we need is this invoices per page. And if I define this at the top, And now I can start to use this pagination component inside of my page. So down at the bottom, let's go ahead and add pagination. We can add our current page equals current page so that we can get that value, or what was it? Yeah, current page is going to be a number. Let's actually import this in. And we can see that it's now working just like it did before. We have all of our pagination, we can navigate through to it, and everything is working just great. But now let's start to see how we can use Suspense for this. So the nice thing is this is really easy. All I need to do is now add my Suspense component. I'm going to wrap that. I'm going to make sure that I actually import Suspense from React. And then I can set a fallback. And I'm not going to go too deep into what that fallback could be. That can really be anything. Let's just say loading, just for illustrative purposes. And if I start to reload the page, we can see that we're not actually getting that experience. And it's because it's just happening too quickly because of how the internet is. But the way that we can illustrate this working is if I now go inside of my pagination component and I do something like await new promise, we're inside, I'm going to set a timeout of, let's set that for 4 seconds so that we can see. I'm going to resolve that as undefined. I'm just going to come from that promise. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm just simply waiting for 4 seconds before I continue with the server component. But now if we refresh the page, we can see that I do get that loading indicator, because what's happening is it's now going to stream in the results later because I'm using that suspense boundary. But as I keep loading, we can see that I still get the list of the initial results of the table because that's not being blocked anymore by that subsequent query. So I'm able to display the critical information, while the pagination, which isn't as important to come in immediately, we can make sure that that comes in as soon as that's available without blocking that original request of the component. Now, something that I don't like about this pagination component in the way that it's currently set up is it's very fixated on this specific query. Now, we could probably add some props to add some conditional logic and make this pretty flexible, but I'd like a better way to be able to manage the query logic for this while still being able to take advantage of suspense. And I personally prefer that I can manage it in a way that's going to be in a similar page or similar location than that initial query that I'm making, because I'm going to need those queries to be very similar in practice, where if I use the pagination on different types of lists of invoices, I'm going to need to be able to manage those differently. Now, one thing we can do is we can abstract this into a prop so that we're passing in this data fetching method as a prop into the component, so that inside of the lifecycle of the component itself, it's going to try to make that request based off of what we're passing in. So kind of illustrating that, if we say, and there's probably going to be a better way to define this TypeScript interface, just bear with me. If I say something like get count, I'm going to make that a function. And if I now get my get count, and instead of this query, I can say my constant of invoices count, or count, I'd probably want to update that to just simply count at that point. I can say equals await get count. But now if I take this query and I go back to where I'm actually setting up the components, I can go down to pagination, and I can now define my get count, where inside that can be a async function in itself, where I now pass in the query and then ultimately return that invoices count. But now if I reload the page, we can see that it's still behaving the same way before. I still have that wait in there, but I'm able to load that initial set of data. I'm able to load in later that count to get that pagination. But now I'm able to do that by passing in this dynamic prop, which I'm able to define right alongside the rest of that same query logic, where I'm passing that into pagination, where I can dynamically get that count and then use it to fulfill the rest of the UI logic for that pagination. Now, I haven't validated that there's no potential drawbacks with this, so just be careful, make sure that you're testing everything when working through it, but I haven't noticed any issues when I've been testing it out myself. But the nice thing about this is now I can define just a single pagination component, so I can contain the logic for that, and it's reusable through everything else, rather than maybe creating different components for each use case of pagination. Maybe I can still share the core pagination one, but I prefer to have the actual data fetching logic abstracted in a way that's close to the original query that I'm making, because they're so closely correlated. And we can see, even with removing that delay, that everything is loading perfectly. Now let's take a step back and see how we can build that full stack app in my upcoming course, where we'll learn how to query and wrangle that data, lock it down with authentication, and even accept payments. So sign up to get exclusive access at spacejelly.dev/nextjs. Next up, I know what you're thinking, how can we dynamically generate and download those invoices as a PDF?